the GP threshold of 20%.
The World Bank, a genuine partner of the ministry, seems hopeful about greater progress as the education sector appears relentless in its numerous interventions, notably the conditional cash transfer and teacher training, where great progress is said to have been registered. The tax team leader for the pledged the World Bank's continued support to the sector.
I congratulate the ministry for its continued strong commitment to the sector, and I think other partners and other countries also see how the education sector in the Gambia is advancing.
Cognizant of the role of education in the realization of the government's development blueprint page, the Ministry of Finance remains steadfast in providing support to the education sector.
Mr. Chairman, it is important to note that the importance of aid and donor coordination in resource mobilization cannot be overemphasized. And this is because functional aid and donor coordination ensure efficient resource management and utilization as outlined in the Paris Declaration. And the government must take ownership and leadership of its development agenda through policies and programs as alluded to above. Before conclusion, I associated myself with the recognition of the accolades just mentioned by the WFP rep to the Minister and the Deputy Permanent Secretary. And I was also glad to witness also another occasion in Washington, D.C., when the Permanent Secretary himself was awarded one of the most prestigious accolades in the world by the World Bank.
Recommendations and way forward emanating from the stock-taking exercise will be taken on board for a more decisive approach to attaining Millennium Development Goals dealing with education. For GRTS News, I am Fatijane Mbai. Well, time now to take our first break. We'll be back with news from outside the Gambia after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Should they stay or should they go? The central question before a traditional council of Afghan elders convening in the Afghan capital Kabul as they get ready to vote on a joint U.S.-Afghan security pact designed to prolong American troop presence. President Hamid Karzai is making the case before several community leaders, arguing that what's at stake is peace. We have more in this DWTV report.
Even the president is seeking their approval. Hundreds of tribal elders, regional politicians, and other dignitaries from across Afghanistan have gathered for the four-day Loya Jirga. Their task is to lay the foundation for the time after the NATO combat mission in Afghanistan ends next year, and the country takes over full responsibility for its security. President Hamid Karzai is proposing a security deal that his government has negotiated with the U.S. It would allow 10 to 15,000 troops from the U.S. and other countries to remain in Afghanistan past the 2014 pullout date, training and advising Afghan forces for another 10 years. But there's a sticking point. The draft agreement would maintain U.S. troops' present immunity to Afghan law. It was a major hurdle in negotiations and remains a status that many Afghans resent. Taliban rebels have denounced the assembly as a U.S. ploy and are threatening to kill delegates who vote in favor of the deal.
World powers have gathered in Geneva to track out a deal on Iran's nuclear program. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and Iran, are negotiating to reach a deal. Officials have expressed optimism, but far differences have surfaced as Iran is accusing the other side of lack of trust, and this is proving to be a huge obstacle to the talks, even as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said the sides are the closest they have ever been to a deal in a decade. CNN senior international correspondent Matthew Chance is in Geneva and has more in this report.
very hard to say. Certainly, you mentioned there John Kerry saying that the sides are the closest they've been for a decade. These have been painstaking negotiations that have taken the various parties through that last 10 years. And so the expectations are very high. And I think it's being seen as like perhaps not the last chance, but we're getting to the end of this process. Is it worth continuing to negotiate with Iran if no agreement is going to be reached? There's also been a number of instances over the past decade where the two sides have been as close as this, or very close indeed, and yet still not managed to come to the right wording, to come to the right understanding that would give a sort of full and permanent deal to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, something, by the way, it says it has no intention of developing, but to ensure that the checks and balances are in there to make sure that Iran couldn't do that in the future. That's what this is all about. The positions, we're told by all the diplomats concerned, are very close now. They're trying to hammer out the details in the gaps between their positions. They've been doing that until late last night, here until about midnight. They resumed talks this morning within the next half an hour. Catherine Ashton, who's leading the negotiations at this stage for the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, is meeting with Mohammad Zarif, the Iran foreign minister, who's leading the negotiators from the Iranian side, in half an hour, and they're going to be continuing to hammer out the detail to see if they can come together and forge a final agreement. But of course, long-time seasoned observers of these negotiations are not ruling out the possibility that these talks will fail, even though they are as close as they seem to be.
And finally, on the international stories, the manhunt for a suspected gunman accused of several shootings across Paris is in police custody. The man threatened a television station and fired into a newspaper office, seriously injuring a photographer. French police said the suspect's DNA was taken at the scene, and it turns out he had a notorious track record. Let's turn to this DWTV report for more on that story.
And after a tip-off led police to an underground parking lot in a Paris suburb. There they found the suspect nearly unconscious after apparently taking an overdose of medication. France's Interior Minister confirmed the man's arrest and his involvement in a series of shooting incidents.
Everything seems to indicate that he tried to commit suicide, but he did not kill himself, which is very important so that we can find out all of the facts, the truth about his motivations.
Officials named the suspect as Abdel Hakim Dakar, who is in his late 40s. Police say they identified him from several DNA samples taken after a series of attacks carried out in Paris over a 4-day period. On Monday, he allegedly opened fire in the offices of the daily Libération newspaper and critically wounded a photographer. Last week, he threatened staff at the 24-hour BFM television station. He also took a driver hostage on the Champs-Élysées and opened fire in front of a bank. Dakar was already known to the police. In the 1990s, he served 4 years for buying a gun that was used in an attack on a police station. 3 policemen and a taxi driver died in a car chase that ensued. The government suspects Dakar of having left the country after his trial. When and why he might have returned to France is currently unclear.
And help thaw U.S. relations with the Russians.
And before we take leave of you, a quick reminder of our stories making headlines. President Jammeh has described the Arab-African Summit as the most successful. This, as he said, was the first time that all issues on the table were discussed. IEC has endorsed the candidacy of APRC's Mani Tenjai and that of Patu Rebajinkar of the opposition NRP ahead of the December 5th by-election for the vacant Kiang West constituency. Afghan President President Hamid Karzai has addressed the lawyer Jigar with the key issue of U.S.-Afghan security pact dominating the agenda. And world powers and Iranian nuclear negotiators have continued to haggle over Tehran's controversial nuclear program. That was all in this edition of the news. Thanks for your time and stay tuned to our interesting programs. Until then, I am Fatou Janembai.